Rikers Island, the brutal reality of food in America's toughest jail. The tray hits the slot like a verdict. 1,700 calories. That is the official number. 1,700 calories to sustain a grown man through 23 hours of confinement, boredom, violence, and despair. The bread is stale by the time it arrives. The protein, if you can call it that, has been processed so many times that it has lost any meaningful connection to the animal it once came from. And the vegetables? They are gray. Not green. Gray. This is not a prison in some distant authoritarian country. This is not a scene from a historical documentary about the gulags. This is Rikers Island. This is New York City. This is today. At any given moment, nearly 5,000 men and women are locked inside this 10-island complex in the East River, the majority of them not yet convicted of any crime. They are awaiting trial. They are, in the eyes of the law, innocent. And this is what innocent looks like when America decides to hold you. What you are about to hear is not just the story of bad food. It is the story of how a society reveals its deepest values through what it chooses to feed the people it has locked away. Here is the question that nobody inside the New York City Department of Correction seems to want to answer. When you control every single moment of a person's day, when you dictate when they sleep, when they wake, when they speak, when they move, and when they eat, what does the meal you serve them actually say? Former detainees have described Rikers food using words that do not belong in the same sentence as nourishment. Rotten. Molded. Infested. Cold in the center and scalding on the edges, having passed through industrial warmers that heat unevenly and without care. They describe drinking powdered juice so watered down it registers as little more than colored water. They describe asking for more, because 1,700 calories is not enough, and being told there is no more. This story goes deeper than a meal. Stay with it. Because somewhere between the kitchen and the tray slot, something important about justice, dignity, and power gets decided, and most people on the outside never ask the question. We are asking it now. Rikers Island. The name alone carries weight in New York City the way few other names do. Formerly known as the New York City Jail Complex, Rikers sits on 413 acres in the East River between Queens and the Bronx, a landmass originally purchased by a Dutch farmer named Abraham Ricken in the 1600s. For nearly a century, it has been the primary detention facility for New York City, receiving the arrested, the awaiting trial, the sentenced to less than a year, and the forgotten. At its peak, Rikers held nearly 22,000 people. Today that number hovers between 4,000 and 6,000 depending on the year and the administration's rhetoric about reform. It is not one jail, it is 10 separate jails on one island, each with its own culture, its own hierarchy, and its own relationship with the food that arrives each morning, noon, and evening through narrow stainless steel slots in reinforced doors. The people inside have no say in what they eat. No choice. No substitution. No recourse except to eat what is placed in front of them or go hungry. And understanding what that food actually is, and what it is not, tells you nearly everything you need to know about Rikers Island. To understand the food at Rikers, you first have to understand the geography of power on that island. The bridge that connects Rikers to Queens is one of the most psychologically significant stretches of asphalt in New York City. It is short, barely a mile long, but crossing it in a Department of Correction bus means entering a world that operates by entirely different rules than the city you just left. The skyline is still visible. The planes from LaGuardia Airport pass directly overhead, close enough that detainees can sometimes read the airline insignia. Freedom is visible. But it is unreachable. The kitchen at Rikers, officially called the Central Commissary, is a massive industrial operation. It prepares upward of 15,000 meals per day. Meals travel from that central kitchen to individual jails in large insulated containers, then are transferred to smaller trays and delivered through the kind of mechanized slot system that reduces human contact to near zero. That reduction of contact is not accidental. It is policy. And within that policy, within that deliberate minimization of the human element, lies the origin of everything that has made Rikers food one of the most documented failures in American incarceration history. The stakes of this story are not abstract. In 2021, a federal monitor assigned to oversee Rikers Island filed a report that described food conditions so severe they constituted a threat to basic human health. Detainees were receiving meals that fell below minimum caloric requirements. Meals were arriving spoiled. In some units, food was being used by correction officers as a tool of informal discipline, delayed, withheld, or served cold as a quiet punishment for behavior that had not risen to the level of a formal infraction. Men who entered Rikers at healthy weights were leaving visibly thinner. Not because they were exercising. Because they were not eating enough to maintain basic body mass. And yet the city of New York spent, and continues to spend, hundreds of millions of dollars annually running this facility. The money is there. The infrastructure is there. What is missing is something harder to legislate than a budget line. What is missing is the political will to treat the people inside that fence as human beings whose basic biological needs deserve to be met, not as a reward for good behavior, but as a baseline condition of existence. That is what this story is really about. Before we go any further, if you are new here, this channel covers prison stories, true crime, and the systems most people never see from the inside. Stories like this one drop every week, and what comes next in this story gets significantly darker. Hit subscribe so you do not miss it. Now let's get back to Rikers. Early life, the history of food at Rikers. There was a time when Rikers Island actually grew its own food. For decades in the early 20th century, incarcerated men on Rikers farmed the land. They raised pigs and chickens. They cultivated vegetables in fields that covered significant portions of the island. The farm operation was not born of compassion, it was born of economics. The city of New York realized early that feeding thousands of people 3 times a day was expensive, and that the cheapest labor available was the labor of the men already inside. Former Rikers detainees from the mid-20th century have described meals that, by comparison to today's standards, sound almost civilized. Hot food, cooked on site, served by other incarcerated workers who understood what it meant to be hungry. There was still degradation in that system. The labor was extracted under coercion, but there was also a connection between the food and the people eating it that simply no longer exists. The farms are gone now. The pigs and chickens are gone. The vegetable plots were paved over as the island expanded to accommodate the explosion of incarceration that began in the 1970s and peaked in the 1990s. What replaced the farm was the industrial kitchen. What replaced dignity was efficiency. And somewhere in that transition, the food at Rikers stopped being food in any meaningful human sense. The turning point, mass incarceration transforms the menu. The turning point came quietly, hidden inside a crime wave. In the 1970s and especially through the 1980s, New York City's incarcerated population exploded. Mandatory minimum sentencing. The Rockefeller drug laws. Stop and frisk policing strategies that swept enormous numbers of young men, predominantly Black and Latino, into the criminal justice system. The population at Rikers tripled, then tripled again. The kitchen could not keep up. More accurately, the kitchen was never given the resources to keep up. Rather than invest in proportionally larger and better food preparation infrastructure, the city doubled down on cheaper ingredients and faster preparation methods. Contracts were awarded not to local suppliers with quality products but to industrial distributors offering the lowest possible price per unit. This is the moment when the food at Rikers became a system rather than a meal. Menus were standardized not for nutrition but for cost minimization. Proteins became textured soy rather than actual meat. Breads were extended with fillers. Portions were calculated to meet legal minimums, not human needs. And critically, no one was watching. The men inside could not vote. They had no lobby. They had no press access. The degradation of their food happened in a vacuum of accountability, and it continued, incrementally, year after year, until what sat on the tray in front of a Rikers detainee in 2010 would have been unrecognizable to the same man's grandmother as a meal. First complaints, early legal and advocacy warnings. The complaints did not start in 2020. They did not start in 2010. They started decades earlier, and they were ignored with remarkable consistency. As early as the 1990s, advocates and attorneys representing incarcerated individuals at Rikers were documenting food-related grievances in court filings. Spoiled milk. Undercooked chicken, a serious health risk given that raw poultry carries salmonella. Meals arriving so cold in winter that the fat in the protein had congealed into a solid white cap, rendering the food nearly impossible to eat and certainly impossible to digest properly. The city's standard response to these complaints was a pattern that would repeat itself for 30 years: acknowledge the concern, promise an investigation, announce improvements, implement nothing of substance, wait for the media attention to fade, and return to business as usual. Former correctional health nurses who worked inside Rikers during this period have described seeing detainees with vitamin deficiencies, conditions that should not be possible in a developed nation's largest city. Scurvy. Iron deficiency severe enough to cause hair loss. Weight loss in men who were not ill when they arrived but became ill because they could not sustain adequate nutrition on what the facility was providing. These were not secrets. They were documented, reported, filed, and then quietly filed away. The crime setup, the contracting system that made it worse. To understand how the food got this bad, you have to follow the money. And the money leads directly to the contracting system. For much of its recent history, food services at Rikers Island have been managed through large-scale municipal contracts awarded to institutional food service companies. These are the same companies that supply food to schools, hospitals, military bases, and other facilities where the people eating have no choice about what they receive. The incentive structure of these contracts is built entirely around cost per meal metrics. A contractor who delivers a meal at 63 cents per person wins over a contractor who delivers a meal at 90 cents per person, regardless of what those additional 27 cents would have bought in terms of nutritional value or food safety. City budget pressures have historically allowed these contractors enormous latitude. Inspections were infrequent. Penalties for violations were minimal compared to the savings generated by cutting corners on ingredient quality. And the people most affected by the resulting food, the detainees, had almost no formal mechanism for lodging complaints that would trigger meaningful consequences. Several investigative journalists who examined Rikers' food contracts found that millions of dollars allocated for food services could not be fully accounted for. Not necessarily stolen, the accounting was simply imprecise enough that it was impossible to trace exactly where the money designated for food actually went. Key players, the people who have tried to change it. Against this entrenched system, a small number of people have fought, publicly and persistently, to force change. The Legal Aid Society of New York has filed repeated actions on behalf of Rikers detainees related to food conditions. Attorneys representing individuals at Rikers have documented specific incidents: a man receiving a tray with visible mold, a diabetic detainee denied the medically appropriate diet prescribed by a jail physician, a Muslim detainee receiving food during Ramadan that violated his religious dietary requirements despite formal documentation of those requirements being on file. The Nunez Consent Decree, a federal agreement reached in 2015 following a landmark case about violence at Rikers, created the position of a federal monitor with oversight authority over the facility. That monitor's reports, public documents filed with a federal court, have repeatedly cited food as one of the facility's most persistent and documented failures. Former NYC Council member Daniel Drum spent years pushing for hearings specifically focused on food quality at Rikers, citing constituent reports from families of detainees who arrived to visit their loved ones visibly malnourished. Each hearing generated headlines. Each set of headlines generated promises. Each set of promises generated very little. The pattern was so consistent it began to look less like institutional failure and more like institutional design. The days before, the daily rhythm of Rikers mealtime. There is a rhythm to eating at Rikers. It does not resemble the rhythm of eating anywhere else. Breakfast arrives between 3 and 5 in the morning, a time chosen not for the detainees' benefit but for the kitchen's scheduling convenience. Men who are finally sleeping after nights disrupted by noise, fear, and artificial lighting are woken by the sound of a tray being shoved through a slot. The breakfast is typically a small carton of milk, a serving of cereal or a dry muffin, and sometimes a piece of fruit so overripe it has begun to ferment. Those who cannot eat at that hour, because they are asleep, because they are sick, because the smell is wrong, lose that meal. There is no accommodation. There is no alternative. The tray is there and then the tray is gone. Lunch arrives mid-morning. Dinner arrives in the early afternoon, sometimes as early as 4 o'clock. This means that from approximately 4:30 in the afternoon until 3 the following morning, there is no food. That is a fast of 10 to 11 hours, every single night, for men consuming fewer than 2,000 calories during the waking portion of the day. Former detainees describe going to sleep with a stomach that is not full. Not dramatically empty, just persistently, quietly not full. Night after night. Week after week. It is a deprivation that does not announce itself dramatically. It accumulates. The point of no return, when food becomes control. This is where the story moves past institutional failure into something more deliberate. Multiple former Rikers detainees, in documented accounts available in court records, news investigations, and advocacy reports, have described a practice that has no formal name but is universally understood inside the facility. It is the use of food as an informal punishment. A man says something to a correction officer that the officer interprets as disrespectful. The officer does not file a formal disciplinary report, doing so would generate paperwork, hearings, oversight. Instead, the next time the food cart comes through, that man's tray is the last to arrive. Or it arrives with less on it. Or it arrives already opened, and something is missing from inside. Nothing provable. Nothing reportable. Just the quiet message that in here, compliance is the cost of calories. This is the point of no return in the story of Rikers food. Because once food becomes a tool of interpersonal control rather than a baseline provision of basic human care, you have crossed into a category of institutional harm that has a specific name in international human rights law. You have crossed into the territory of cruel and unusual treatment. And you have done it not with a policy memo but with a lunch tray. What happened next, inside those walls, was about to become impossible to ignore. The crime unfolds, the 2021 crisis breaks open. In the summer of 2021, Rikers Island collapsed. The word collapsed is not hyperbole. The federal monitor assigned to the facility filed an emergency report that described conditions he characterized as a humanitarian crisis. And food was not a footnote in that report. Food was one of its central chapters. Detainees were going days without receiving full meals. The meal delivery system had broken down so severely, in part because of staffing shortages, in part because of deliberate slowdowns by correction officers engaged in a labor dispute with the city, that men in some housing units were receiving 1 meal a day instead of 3. In some documented cases, detainees went more than 24 hours without any food delivery at all. The consequences were immediate and visible. Incarcerated individuals lost weight rapidly. Several were hospitalized. Men with pre-existing medical conditions that required dietary management, diabetes, hypertension, kidney disease, experienced acute health crises directly attributable to the disruption of their medically necessary diets. Attorneys from the Legal Aid Society gained emergency court access to the facility. What they documented inside they described in court filings as unlike anything they had seen in decades of visiting Rikers. Trays of rotting food left uncollected. Men pressing their faces against cell windows begging for food from other detainees. An atmosphere, one attorney wrote, that felt less like a detention facility in a major American city and more like something from a completely different era of human civilization. The aftermath, the city's response. New York City's official response to the 2021 crisis was a masterclass in managed appearance. Mayor Bill de Blasio, in the final months of his administration, acknowledged that conditions at Rikers had deteriorated. His language was careful. He described it as a challenge. He described the food situation as concerning. He announced that the city was working to address staffing shortfalls and that meal delivery would be normalized as quickly as possible. What he did not do, what neither he nor any other official did in the immediate aftermath, was name the structural cause. The crisis was framed as a staffing problem, a logistics problem, an operational problem. It was not framed as what it actually was, the predictable outcome of decades of disinvestment, negligence, and a political culture that had treated the people inside Rikers as an afterthought rather than a constituency. the Department of Correction issued memos about improved food delivery protocols. An outside food service vendor was brought in temporarily to supplement the central commissary's output. City council members who had spent years warning about conditions at Rikers held press conferences outside the bridge expressing outrage that the people inside could be forgiven for noting had arrived somewhat late. The cameras eventually left. The emergency language faded. And the men inside Rikers Island were left, once again, waiting for a tray through a slot in a door. The investigation, Federal Monitor's findings. The Federal Monitor assigned to Rikers, operating under the Núñez Consent Decree, is one of the few figures in this story with actual institutional teeth. His reports are filed with a federal district court. They are public. They are binding. And what they contained about food at Rikers Island was damning in the specific, documented way that legal filings have to be. Report after report documented the same recurring failures. Meal delivery times that violated the facility's own written standards. Food served at temperatures that created bacterial growth risk. Special dietary accommodations, medical, religious, and cultural, being routinely ignored because the kitchen lacked either the staff or the will to manage individualized preparation at scale. One section of the Monitor's 2021 emergency report focused specifically on the relationship between food deprivation and violence within the facility. The connection he documented was not speculative, it was drawn from incident reports, medical records, and direct observation. Hunger, the Monitor found, was a direct driver of interpersonal conflict inside Rikers. Men who were not getting enough to eat became desperate. Desperation became aggression. Aggression became the kind of violence that made Rikers Island the most dangerous jail in the United States by virtually every measurable metric. The food was not separate from the violence. The food was one of its causes. The evidence, former detainees speak. The federal reports tell part of the story. The rest lives in the testimony of the men who ate those meals. One former Rikers detainee, a man held at the facility for 14 months while awaiting trial, ultimately acquitted of the charges against him, described the Rikers food experience in an account published by a New York civil rights advocacy organization. His words are clinical in the way that only someone who has genuinely processed trauma can be clinical. He described the first week as disorienting. Not just the confinement, the food. Accustomed to 3 meals a day that bore some relationship to actual ingredients, he received his first Rikers breakfast and sat with it for 20 minutes, trying to identify what was in front of him. The thing that was supposed to be eggs did not smell like eggs. The thing that was supposed to be juice did not taste like juice. The bread was edible, barely. By the 3rd week, he said, he stopped trying to identify what he was eating and simply ate it. That shift, from trying to evaluate the food to simply consuming it, was, he said, one of the more disturbing adaptations he noticed in himself. He had stopped expecting the food to be food. He had started expecting it to be fuel. Minimal, unsatisfying, inadequate fuel. He lost 22 pounds in 14 months. He was not trying to lose weight. The net closes, lawsuits, legislation, and public pressure. By 2022, the combination of the Federal Monitor's reports, legal advocacy, and sustained press attention had created something that had not existed before in the specific context of Rikers food, accountability with consequences. The Legal Aid Society filed emergency court motions specifically addressing food conditions, seeking judicial intervention, not just monitoring recommendations, to force the city to meet minimum nutritional standards. Federal Judge Laura Taylor Swain, who oversees the Núñez Consent Decree, indicated she was prepared to hold the city in contempt if documented improvements were not made on an accelerated timeline. The New York City Council held a series of hearings specifically focused on food at Rikers. Former detainees testified. Medical professionals testified. A registered dietitian who reviewed the meal records that had been obtained through public records requests testified that the documented caloric content of Rikers meals was, in certain periods, below the minimum caloric intake guidelines established for inmates in New York state law. Not meeting a goal. Not falling short of a best practice. Violating the law. The city negotiated. Made commitments. Hired a new food service coordinator. Promised transparency. The same question that had been asked at every prior moment of accountability, was whether this time, anything would actually be different. That answer was beginning to emerge from inside the walls. The arrest, the moment the system got caught. The moment the food system at Rikers Island was truly caught, truly exposed in a way that could not be dismissed as advocacy hyperbole or legal overreach, came from the city's own numbers. Investigative reporters at the city, a New York journalism nonprofit that covers city government accountability, filed Freedom of Information law requests for the actual caloric content documentation that Rikers was required to maintain for its food service contractor. What those documents showed, when they were finally produced, was that during multiple periods between 2019 and 2022, the average daily caloric content of meals delivered to detainees at Rikers fell below the 1,500-calorie threshold. Not the 1,700-calorie figure the city cited as its standard. Not any recognized minimum for incarcerated adults. Below 1,500 calories per day. In some units, in some months, below 1,300. A moderately active adult male requires between 2,000 and 2,500 calories per day to maintain body weight. A person consuming 1,300 calories per day will lose body weight at a clinically significant rate within weeks. That is not a condition anyone would choose. That is not a diet. That is a slow, administrative, institutionally sanctioned form of physical diminishment. The documents were public. The numbers were the city's own. There was nowhere left to hide. We are halfway through this story and it gets significantly heavier from here. If what you have heard so far has made you think, about justice, about power, about what we tolerate when it is hidden behind a wall, subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one are exactly what this channel exists for. Hit subscribe, hit the bell. Now let's go back inside. The charges, what the law actually requires. There is a legal framework governing what must happen at Rikers Island. It is worth laying out, not because it has been consistently followed, but precisely because the distance between what is required and what actually occurred is the measure of the failure. New York State correction law requires that incarcerated individuals receive nutritionally adequate meals at regular intervals. The New York City Board of Correction, the independent oversight body responsible for setting minimum standards for city jails, has established specific requirements for caloric minimums, meal timing, food temperature upon service, and dietary accommodation for medical and religious needs. These are not aspirational guidelines. They are legally binding standards. Violating them exposes the city to liability, consent decree contempt proceedings, and the kind of judicial intervention that no city administration, regardless of political orientation, actually wants to experience. The Board of Corrections' minimum standards on food specifically require that meals provide at least 2,000 calories for average adult detainees, with adjustments for individuals with higher metabolic needs. They require that hot food be served at a minimum temperature of 140 degrees Fahrenheit. They require that cold food be served at a maximum of 41 degrees. They require that special dietary needs be documented, tracked, and accommodated within 24 hours of a medical or religious determination. The gap between those requirements and documented practice at Rikers Island, across multiple years and multiple administrations, is not a footnote. It is the story. The defense, how the city justifies it. The city of New York, when pressed, has never denied that food conditions at Rikers have been inadequate. What it has consistently defended is the framework under which those inadequacies exist. The argument the city has made, in various forms across multiple administrations, goes roughly like this: Rikers Island is a uniquely complex operational environment. It processes an extraordinarily high volume of individuals, many of whom arrive with specific medical and behavioral needs. Staffing shortages, supply chain disruptions, security requirements, and the logistical complexity of feeding thousands of people in a secured environment make perfect compliance with every standard at every moment genuinely difficult. This argument is not entirely without merit. Running food service for 5,000 people in a maximum security environment is genuinely complicated in ways that running a restaurant or even a school cafeteria is not. The security requirements alone, ensuring that no utensil becomes a weapon, that no food service worker can be coerced or threatened, that no food delivery becomes a vector for contraband, add layers of complexity that do not exist in civilian food service. But complexity is not the same as inevitability. Other jail systems in the United States, operating under comparable security constraints, have managed to meet nutritional minimums consistently. The argument that the logistics are too difficult is ultimately an argument for increased resources, which the city has consistently declined to allocate at the level required to solve the problem. Key testimony: the survival economy of Rikers. This is where the story inside the walls diverges completely from the story the administration tells about what happens inside the walls. Because the men and women at Rikers did not simply accept what they were given. They built an economy around their hunger. The commissary at Rikers, the system through which detainees with money in their accounts can purchase supplemental food items, became not a luxury system but a survival system. Ramen noodles, which sell for approximately $1 per packet at the commissary, became the most valuable currency inside the facility. Not because anyone particularly enjoyed instant noodles. Because instant noodles are calories. Compact, shelf-stable, tradable calories. Detainees with commissary access shared with those without. Those without traded services, doing another man's laundry, helping someone write a letter to an attorney, translating for a Spanish-speaking detainee dealing with a monolingual corrections officer, in exchange for food. This informal economy is not a sign of a community thriving. It is a sign of a community adapting to deprivation. It is what happens when the basic contract between a detaining institution and the people it detains, "We will keep you safe and fed," breaks down completely. People do not simply accept malnutrition. They compensate. They trade. They share. They find a way. But they should not have to. The verdict: what the courts have found. The courts have now said, repeatedly and unambiguously, that what has happened with food at Rikers Island is not acceptable. The Federal Monitor's reports, which carry the force of court filings, have specifically cited food conditions as a persistent area of non-compliance with the Núñez Consent Decree. That consent decree, entered into voluntarily by the City of New York, committed the city to bringing Rikers into compliance with constitutional standards. Food conditions that cause medical harm to incarcerated individuals are, under established constitutional law, a violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Judge Swain has held multiple status conferences specifically addressing food at Rikers. She has ordered the city to produce documentation of its remedial plans. She has set timelines for compliance and requested verification mechanisms. She has, in the measured but unmistakable language of the federal judiciary, communicated that the city is on notice. More significantly, in 2022, the Board of Correction, the city's own oversight body, found the Department of Correction in violation of minimum standards on food. Not the federal government. Not an outside advocate. The city found itself in violation of its own rules. That finding did not generate a dramatic judicial moment. It generated a compliance plan, a set of deadlines, and a series of monitoring requirements. Whether those mechanisms have teeth, whether the system has finally changed, is a question the walls of Rikers have not finished answering. Sentencing: the true cost of Rikers food. Let us be specific about the medical cost of what has happened at Rikers, not in abstract terms but in the language of clinical consequence. Prolonged caloric restriction in an adult male produces a predictable and documented sequence of physiological effects. Within the first 2 weeks, glycogen stores are depleted and the body begins catabolizing muscle tissue. By the second month, measurable muscle mass loss is occurring. By the third month, immune function is compromised. Wound healing slows. Cognitive function, already challenged by the stress of incarceration, degrades further. Men whose lives and legal futures depend on being able to think clearly, to remember details, to communicate effectively with their attorneys, are being physiologically impaired by their diet. Correctional health professionals who have worked inside Rikers have published accounts describing conditions they would characterize, in any other setting, as evidence of neglect. Anemia. Vitamin deficiencies. Malnutrition-related skin conditions. In men who arrived at the facility healthy. And these are not the worst cases. The worst cases involve the men who entered Rikers with pre-existing medical conditions and whose dietary management requirements were not met. Diabetics whose insulin dosing was calibrated to meal timing that did not exist. Men with kidney disease receiving protein levels incompatible with their medical condition. Individuals on cardiac medications that required specific food interactions to work safely. The food at Rikers has not just caused hunger. It has caused harm. Entry into prison, the first tray, a ritual of power. There is something specific that happens at Rikers when a new person arrives and receives their first meal. Former detainees have described it with a consistency that suggests it functions less as a routine event and more as an initiation, an institutional ritual that communicates, without words, exactly where you stand. The tray arrives before you have fully processed where you are. Before you have fully understood the sounds of the place, the smell of it, the particular quality of silence that is somehow louder than noise. And what is on that tray is the first concrete communication from the institution to you. Not the intake processing. Not the uniform they hand you. Not even the cell door closing. The tray is the message. Because the tray tells you what you are worth to the system that now has complete control over your body. Former detainees describe looking at that first tray and feeling something they struggle to articulate, something between disgust and a strange, creeping fear. Not fear of the food itself. Fear of what the food implied. If this is what they think you deserve, what else might they think is acceptable? If the baseline care is this, what does the extraordinary look like? The first tray at Rikers is not just a meal. It is a statement of institutional intent. And it has been saying the same thing, to thousands of people, for decades. Life behind bars, the psychology of institutional eating. Psychologists who study incarceration have documented something that makes intuitive sense but is rarely discussed in policy conversations about prison food. The act of eating, and the conditions under which eating occurs, are profoundly connected to psychological health and human dignity. Human beings are social animals. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, eating was a communal act. It was the moment of the day when the group reconvened, shared resources, and reaffirmed their collective existence. Eating alone, eating poorly, eating without choice, eating in fear, these are not neutral experiences. They are experiences that affect how people understand their own worth, their own place in a human community. At Rikers, many detainees eat alone in cells. The move away from communal dining, driven by security concerns that are not entirely without basis, cafeteria settings have historically been sites of assault in jails and prisons, has removed one of the few remaining social dimensions of incarceration. Former detainees describe meals eaten in solitude as one of the more psychologically destabilizing aspects of their time at Rikers. Not because they needed the company of other incarcerated people, but because eating alone, eating badly, eating without any of the contextual signals that make food feel nourishing, sitting at a table, using real plates, having a choice, sharing the moment with another person, strips the experience of all its human meaning. What remains is biological fueling. And when the fuel is inadequate, even that is failing. The twist, the plan to close Rikers and what it means. Here is the twist that changes everything you think you know about the story of food at Rikers Island. New York City has voted to close it. In October 2019, the New York City Council voted to approve a plan to shut down Rikers Island entirely by 2027 and replace it with 4 smaller, borough-based jail facilities, one in each of the city's boroughs except Staten Island. The stated rationale was exactly what this story has been about. The conditions at Rikers Island were irredeemable, not because reform was theoretically impossible, but because the combination of scale, history, institutional culture, and geographic isolation had created a facility that could not be fixed from within. The new facilities, according to their designers and advocates, would be built on a fundamentally different model. Smaller populations. More programming. Better sightlines and supervision structures that reduced the conditions in which brutality could occur invisibly. And significantly, better food. Not as an afterthought. As a design principle built into the new facilities from the ground up. The plan sounded, in the language of its advocates, genuinely transformative. A city finally acknowledging that what it had created on that island in the East River was not a jail. It was a catastrophe. And that the only honest response to a catastrophe of that scale was not renovation. It was demolition. But the plan, which sounded simple, turned out to be anything but. The fallout: why Rikers hasn't closed. The 2027 closure deadline for Rikers Island is almost certain to be missed. The reasons are a perfect encapsulation of why reform in American criminal justice is so structurally difficult. Construction of the 4 replacement jails has been delayed repeatedly. Community opposition in several boroughs has slowed permitting processes. Cost overruns: the original budget estimate of approximately $8 billion has expanded significantly, have created political resistance. And the reduction in the city's incarcerated population that was supposed to precede the closure, making the smaller facilities viable, has not occurred at the pace advocates projected. Meanwhile, Rikers remains open. The men and women inside it are eating the same food they were eating before the closure vote. The Federal Monitor continues to file reports. The Legal Aid Society continues to litigate. The Board of Correction continues to cite violations. And the trays continue to come through the slots, carrying the same institutional message they have carried for decades. The gap between what the city has promised and what it has delivered at Rikers Island is wide enough to contain the entire history of American criminal justice reform, every ambitious plan, every landmark court decision, every galvanizing moment of public outrage that produced a press conference, a policy memo, and ultimately very little change in the lived experience of the people for whom the change was promised. The food at Rikers is still inadequate. The people eating it are still waiting. Where are they now? Current conditions. As of the most recent federal monitoring reports, conditions at Rikers Island have improved modestly from the nadir of 2021. Meal delivery times have become more consistent in some facilities within the complex. The caloric floor appears to have stabilized above the most critically inadequate levels documented in the emergency reports of that period. These are real improvements. They should be acknowledged as such. The advocacy, the litigation, the public attention, and the court oversight have demonstrably produced better conditions than existed at the worst moments. The system is not, at this writing, in the acute crisis it experienced in 2021. But modest improvement from crisis does not equal adequacy. The standards being met today are still, in the assessment of correctional health experts and the facility's own oversight monitors, below what basic human dignity requires. The improvements are fragile, dependent on the continued presence of federal oversight that could be reduced or modified. They are dependent on political attention that has historically cycled away from Rikers the moment the headlines fade. And they are improvements measured against a baseline so low that even reaching it represents a form of institutional failure. Congratulating the city for no longer serving meals below 1,300 calories is a little like congratulating someone for no longer driving the wrong way on the freeway. The baseline matters. The people inside Rikers today are eating better than they were 3 years ago. They are still not eating well. The bigger picture: what Rikers food tells us about America. Rikers Island is not an anomaly. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand. The United States incarcerates more people per capita than any other nation on earth. More than Russia. More than China. More than any authoritarian regime that American political culture regularly criticizes for its human rights record. There are currently more than 2 million people incarcerated in American jails and prisons on any given day. The conditions in which they are held, including what they are fed, are largely invisible to the 250 million Americans who are not directly connected to the system by incarceration, family membership, or professional obligation. What Rikers represents is not a uniquely New York failure. It is an American failure that happens to be concentrated on a visible island in the East River of the country's most photographed city. Other jails, in less scrutinized places, have documented food conditions that are as bad or worse than Rikers, without federal monitors, without consent decrees, without legal aid society attorneys filing emergency motions. The story of food at Rikers is ultimately a story about what a society decides it is willing to see. About who gets counted as a person whose basic needs matter. About the distance between the language of justice that appears in court filings and political speeches, and the gray tray of inadequate, unidentifiable food that gets shoved through a slot in a door in the actual, physical, unchoreographed reality of American incarceration. The question the food at Rikers asks is not really about food. It is about us. There is a philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas who wrote that the moral act begins in the encounter with the face of another human being, in the recognition that the other person's existence places an obligation on you. That their vulnerability, their hunger, their need, is not separate from your humanity but is, in some deep sense, its test. The men and women inside Rikers Island are separated from the rest of New York City by a bridge and a fence and a bureaucratic designation. They have committed crimes, some of them. Others are waiting for a court to decide. All of them are eating food that has been designed not to nourish them but to meet a minimum legal threshold while costing as little as possible. What would it mean to look at that fact honestly? Not to excuse the crimes. Not to ignore the genuine challenges of incarceration management. But to look at the tray and ask, simply, is this what we want to be? Rikers Island sits in the East River, visible from the windows of planes landing at LaGuardia. Millions of people fly over it every year. Most of them do not know what happens there. Most of them do not know what is on the tray. Now you know. If this story made you think, if it disturbed you, challenged you, or changed something in how you see the system, then this channel is exactly for you. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Every week, we go inside the stories that the outside world has decided not to look at. I will see you in the next one.